Before I tell you what life was really like for a medieval kid, let me ask you something. What if everything you've been taught about childhood was completely wrong? I always assumed kids were treated the way we think of them today, but once I started digging into medieval history, I realized the truth was a whole lot more surprising. Back in 1960, the author Philippe Ariès published a controversial book called Centuries of Childhood, A Social History of Family Life. In it, he argued that in medieval society, the very idea of childhood simply didn't exist. That's a bold claim, so I want to go back in time and see if it's actually true. Was childhood really a modern invention? What was it like to be a teenager during the Middle Ages? At what age did children have to start earning a living? And why was a girl named Elizabeth Paston beaten so severely that her head was broken? Stick with me, because we're going to uncover all of that. If you've spent any time on this channel, you already know I'm a complete medieval history nerd. I can never get enough of learning how people lived hundreds of years ago, and I'm always searching for another fascinating story from the past. That's exactly what we're diving into today as we explore what it was actually like to grow up during the medieval period. And if you're watching this, I'm guessing you're just like me and can't get enough of everything connected to the Middle Ages. Before we jump into today's story, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, March of Empires, an awesome medieval MMO strategy game that's available on both desktop and mobile. I've been playing it lately and honestly it's been hard to put down. The game combines two things I really enjoy, feeling like an unstoppable medieval warrior and building a powerful empire in a massive online strategy game. There are tons of ways to make your kingdom your own. You can strengthen your castle, choose the faction that fits your style, and command your armies in large-scale battles. Of course, you don't have to charge into every fight like a ruthless barbarian. That's definitely the route I'd take, but the choice is yours. You can join one of four unique factions: the Sultan, the King, the Tsar, or the Shogun warrior. Whether you prefer working alongside other players to build the strongest empire in the world or going your own way and conquering everything alone, the game gives you plenty of freedom to play however you like. One of my favourite features is the regular historical events. You can take part in famous conflicts featuring legendary figures like Joan of Arc, Saladin versus Richard the Lionheart, and Halfdan Ragnarsson versus Alfred the Great. Personally, anyone who led the great heathen army and happened to be the brother of Ivar the Boneless is already getting my support. During these special events, you get to choose which side you'll fight for, and you can even unlock authentic historical characters as you progress. So if you've been looking for a new medieval strategy game, now's the perfect time to give it a try. It's completely free to play, and if you use the link in my description, you'll receive some helpful in-game rewards to give you a great start. Be sure to jump into the historical event beginning on March 30th, where Saladin faces Richard the Lionheart. The only question left is, which side will you choose in this crusade? Welcome to... Have you ever wondered when people first became teenagers? I always assumed every generation went through that awkward stage between being a kid and becoming an adult. But the more I learned about the Middle Ages, the more I realised that this idea might be far more modern than I ever imagined. A is for adolescence. From what historians understand, the Middle Ages didn't really have a youth culture like the one we're familiar with today. In fact, many believe the idea of adolescence, that in-between stage separating childhood from adulthood, wasn't recognised the way it is now. When children were young, boys and girls usually played together in mixed groups. Surprisingly, it wasn't their gender that determined who they spent time with. More often than not, it was their family's social status that shaped their friendships and daily lives. Some medieval theologians believed childhood was a period of purity. In their view, innocence lasted only until puberty arrived. Once boys and girls began to mature, they believed lust entered their lives, bringing temptation and causing them to lose that childhood innocence. Not everyone agreed, though. Some people followed the teachings of Augustine of Hippo, who argued that children were sinful from the very moment they were conceived. His belief came from the biblical story of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man, which he saw as proof that every person was born carrying the stain of original sin. As children grew into their teenage years, the differences between boys and girls became much more noticeable. Girls were expected to remain chaste, and their lives were watched much more closely than those of boys. Instead of enjoying much independence, a young woman would usually leave one household only to enter another. She might become a servant, begin an apprenticeship, or marry, but her life almost always remained centered around a home. Young men had a little more freedom when it came to expectations about chastity, but that didn't mean they were truly independent. Most had to work under a master, depend on him for their wages, and obey whatever rules he set. Real financial freedom often felt very far away. To make matters even harder, the legal age for inheriting property was 21. Until then, many young men had little control over their own future, leaving them to wait years before they could finally stand on their own. And as you'll soon see, growing up in the medieval world only became more demanding from there. Have you ever imagined leaving home at 12 years old, knowing you wouldn't come back for years? I used to think childhood was all about growing up slowly, but in the Middle Ages, many kids were expected to start building a career before they were even teenagers. And once they entered an apprenticeship, there was no turning back. Apprenticeship. Beginning in the 11th century, towns expanded rapidly, and many of them grew into thriving cities. As they became larger, they created opportunities for all kinds of new occupations. For the first time, people could choose from a wide variety of trades that often offered better pay and greater security than spending their lives as soldiers or farmers. Skilled workers such as masons, bakers, weavers, blacksmiths and millers organized themselves into guilds. These organizations helped maintain professional standards, defended the rights of their members, regulated prices, and prevented unlicensed workers from competing with them. By the later Middle Ages, it had become common for children to begin apprenticeships somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14. Some, however, started learning a trade much earlier, with a few beginning as young as 7 years old. For boys, an apprenticeship usually lasted around 7 years, often carrying them into their early 20s before they completed their training. Girls typically remained in their apprenticeship until they married rather than serving for a fixed number of years. Once a child entered an apprenticeship, they became part of their master's household. From that point on, the master was responsible for the child's well-being, providing a place to sleep, meals and clothing instead of regular wages. In return, the apprentice had to follow a strict set of rules. They promised not to gamble, stay away from local inns, and avoid any sexual relationships with members of the household. They were encouraged to spend time with the other children living there, but above all else, absolute obedience to the master was expected. Many children learned their parents' trade simply by helping with daily chores and watching them work. Others entered formal apprenticeships, but these usually required a payment from their parents. Because of that, only families with enough money could afford to secure these opportunities for their children. Since apprentices often work for years with little more than food, clothing, and shelter in return, many eventually became unhappy and ran away. When that happened, both the child's father and the master were expected to search for the missing apprentice, taking turns looking for them on alternating days. If an apprentice still hadn't been found after an entire year of searching, the master was no longer required to take the child back. At that point, the apprenticeship was effectively over. Not every trade demanded the same amount of training. A future cook might only need about 2 years to master the necessary skills, while someone training to become a goldsmith could spend as long as 10 years learning the craft before being allowed to open a business of their own. Before earning full status, every apprentice had one final challenge. They had to create a masterpiece, a finished piece of work that demonstrated everything they had learned throughout their training. Successfully completing it proved they were ready to practice their trade independently. For those who couldn't afford to establish their own workshop after qualifying, there was another path. They travelled from town to town, hiring themselves out wherever skilled work was available. These travelling craftsmen became known as journeymen, and for many that was the beginning of an entirely new chapter of life. When I think about bedtime stories, I picture fairy tales and happy endings, but the more I looked into the Middle Ages, the more I realized that the stories many children heard before bed weren't meant to entertain them, they were meant to prepare them for a very unforgiving world. B is for the book at bedtime. There's very little evidence that medieval parents regularly read bedtime stories to their children the way many families do today. Even so, storytelling was an important part of everyday life during the Middle Ages. Stories were shared from one generation to the next, and some parents even wrote books and letters specifically for their own children to read. These writings weren't usually created just for fun. More often than not, they were meant to teach important lessons about life and proper behaviour. One well-known example is the Book of the Knight of the Tower. It was written in 1371 by the French nobleman Geoffrey IV de la Tour Landry for his daughters. His goal was to prepare them for life at the royal court by teaching them how they should behave and what dangers they needed to avoid. Throughout the book, Geoffrey warned his daughters about charming courtiers who might flatter them with sweet words, only to bring dishonour upon them and shame their family. He also cautioned them against vanity and made his views on proper conduct very clear, criticising behaviour that he believed reflected the poor morals of many people around him. His concern for his daughters wasn't surprising. Geoffrey had fought during the 100 Years' War, including at the Siege of Aiguillon, and he had seen firsthand how uncertain and dangerous life could be. As a nobleman, he was also familiar with the politics, scandals and hidden agendas of the French royal court, giving him plenty of reasons to worry about the future his daughters would face. He also wrote a separate instructional book for his sons. Unfortunately, that work has apparently been lost and no longer survives. In 1483, during the reign of Edward V, the Book of the Knight of the Tower was translated into English by William Caxton, the man widely believed to have introduced the printing press to England. The book quickly became one of the most respected and fashionable guides on moral behaviour during the late Middle Ages. Its influence didn't stop there. The work was also translated into German and Dutch. One German version was prepared by Marquard von Stein especially for his own daughters, Elsa and Jacobia, showing that parents across medieval Europe shared the same desire to guide and protect their children through the written word. And while books could teach children how they were expected to behave, everyday life would soon test those lessons in ways far harsher than any story ever could. I always assumed medieval parents loved their children just as much as parents do today, but then I came across a theory that completely challenged that idea. Was childhood really so fragile that some families tried not to become too attached, or is the truth much more complicated? C is for care. Some historians have argued that medieval parents showed less affection and interest toward their young children than parents generally do today. One of the strongest supporters of this idea was the historian Philippe Ariès, whom we talked about earlier. Ariès believed the extremely high death rate among infants shaped the way medieval families viewed childhood. According to his theory, many people of the time saw young children as beings who had not yet fully developed either physically or mentally. In his view, they were thought to exist in a fragile state somewhere between this world and the next. Death was an unavoidable part of everyday life during the Middle Ages. Plague outbreaks and countless other diseases were always a threat, and children were especially vulnerable because their immune systems had not fully developed. Because losing a child was such a real possibility, Ariès argued that many parents may have hesitated to form deep emotional bonds with their children. If death could come at almost any moment, becoming too attached may have seemed like inviting unbearable heartbreak. He also pointed to other evidence that he believed supported his argument. One example was the apparent frequency of child murder during the medieval period. Up until the 13th century, people found guilty of killing a child were usually sent to their bishop to perform penance. The standard punishment was lifelong excommunication from the church, although that sentence was eventually reduced to 10 years. Shortly after the year 1200, the theologian Robert of Flamborough argued that even 15 years of penance was sufficient if a mother had killed her child child because she was living in extreme poverty and simply could not afford to feed it. Church penalties became even less severe in some circumstances. Exclusion from the church could be reduced to 7 years, and Pope Gregory IX recommended that a mother who had deliberately killed her son should instead enter a religious house. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages that the killing of a living child came to be treated legally as homicide. Many women who killed their infants were believed to be suffering from some form of mental illness rather than acting out of cruelty alone. One example comes from the 1275, when Matilda Leving of Bourbon killed her 2 children with an axe while reportedly experiencing a violent fever and a state of madness. Rather than receiving the harshest possible punishment, she was released into the care of her family and was eventually granted a pardon. Historians who argue that children occupied a lower place in medieval society also point to several other factors. Widespread child labour, the abandonment of children, and the harsh discipline many young people endured have all been used to support the idea that childhood was very different from the way we understand it today. And that brings me to the next question. If discipline was considered a normal part of growing up, just how far were medieval parents willing to go? That's exactly what we'll look at next, with D is for discipline. When I started looking into how medieval children were disciplined, I expected strict rules. What I didn't expect was just how accepted physical punishment was, even among wealthy families. And one real story I came across completely changed the way I think about growing up in the Middle Ages. D is for discipline. Throughout the Middle Ages, corporal punishment was considered a normal and acceptable way for parents, teachers, and employers to discipline young people. Physical beatings weren't generally questioned, as long as people believed they were justified and didn't cross the line into what was considered excessive. Even respected writers and scholars supported the practice. In the 14th century, the poet William Langland wrote in Piers Plowman that tradesmen should discipline their children rather than spoil them, especially during a time when fear of plague and hardship shapes everyday life. Harsh punishment wasn't limited to poor families either. Noble households often followed the same approach. One striking example comes from 1449. Elizabeth Paston, the daughter of Agnes Paston, the widow of Judge William Paston, refused to marry an elderly suitor. In response, her mother forbade her from seeing anyone outside the household for 3 months. During that time, Agnes beat her daughter at least once or twice every week, and according to contemporary accounts, sometimes even twice in a single day. The beatings were so severe that Elizabeth's head was reportedly broken in 2 or 3 places. 9 years later, in 1458, Agnes showed the same attitude toward discipline when she wrote to the master responsible for educating her 16-year-old son, Clement, who was studying in London. She encouraged the teacher to correct him firmly until he improved. Even though physical punishment was widely accepted, people still argued over where the line should be drawn. Some cases eventually reached the courts, but the question usually wasn't whether a child should have been punished at all. Instead, judges focused on whether the punishment had become unnecessarily cruel. If an adult was found to have gone too far, they could face punishment themselves. Excessive violence reflected poorly on anyone responsible for educating children, because many people believed that a teacher who constantly relied on beatings was simply failing at the job of teaching. The Benedictine historian Guibert of Nogent shared a personal example in the memoirs he wrote during the early 12th century. As a child, his mother hired a private tutor who lived with the family and taught him from about the age of 6 until he turned 12. According to Guibert, the tutor often punished him brutally whenever he struggled to understand a lesson. Guibert believed the problem wasn't that he lacked intelligence. Instead, he felt his teacher simply wasn't very good at explaining the material. Lessons took place in the dining hall of the family home, which had been turned into a classroom. It was there that Guibert remembered receiving what he described as a far harsher beating than he deserved. Later, his mother noticed the injuries. She saw that his small arms had turned black with bruises and that the skin across his back had swollen from repeated strikes with thin switches. Looking back, it's easy to see why Felipe Ariès' ideas continue to spark debate. Whether or not childhood itself was truly a modern invention is still argued by historians, but one thing is much clearer. Because of the beliefs, customs, and religious attitudes of the time, growing up in the Middle Ages was a completely different experience from the childhood most people know today. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into medieval history, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe for more videos like this. I'll be back next week with another story from the past, and I hope you'll join me. Until then, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.